Hi there. Welcome to Prog Monster. My name is Murph. I'm the host of this show, a show dedicated to progressive rock, hard rock, heavy metal, and other forms of rock music, and now a little bit more. So, anyways, today is Wednesday Night Favorites. So, we have a special thing for you today. It was something suggested by one of the patrons, one of the people who subscribed to me, sorry. He suggested that I do a top 10 debut albums, but once I got started on it, I realized that 10 was not going to cover this even closely, so it's now become the top 25. So it's a top 25 favorite debut albums by a number of bands that you've become familiar with. But the thing about it too is there's a lot of bands that people would normally expect to see on any of my given lists up here, but they're not going to see them on this list because the debut albums for those particular bands just didn't appeal to me. So a lot of my favorite bands are not represented here. It's just the way it is. It's a thing that I discovered as I was going along. There's a few other groups that people would maybe expect possibly to be up here, and I considered listening to them and then putting them on the list if they were good enough. But then I thought, you know what? Most of these albums have had years of me listening to it. Not really very genuine if you take an album you've only listened to once or twice and try to put it in this list. Also, there's quite a few albums I've never listened to that the opportunity to listen to isn't present at the time, so I didn't include them as well. And it may be that they turn out to be really good albums at some point, but I haven't gotten to them yet. So I'm looking at the list, just gradually looking through it a bit, and my honorable mentions, of course, which you know that I normally do. So how this usually works is I do from my least, or in this case 25th, to my best, which is number 1 at the top, and then I do the honorable mentions at the end. The albums from 25 to about 19, these could all flip around on any given day. Just depends on how I feel about them. And then the top 4 albums are in pretty much the same boat. They could flip around at any point as well. Today I chose to do it this way because I weighed the albums against each other based on my love of the albums over the years or my burning love for them right now, and it just came down to that's the way I feel about them today. And this of course doesn't mean by any means that these are the best debut albums of all time. That is very subjective. That's also, if you wanted to get a kind of sense of what's the best album of all time, you'd have to get hundreds and hundreds and maybe thousands of people together voting on it, and then to get a kind of a true sense of what might be considered the best debut album of all time. And that is not going to happen here because this is my favorites. These are my favorites. You may have your own favorites, and that's great because your favorites and my favorites together may stimulate us to listen to stuff that we don't normally listen to. We go outside of our box. That's how we discover new music. I'm looking at some of these bands that were pushed on me by other people that I would probably have never listened to if they hadn't keep pounding me about it, and then eventually they're on my list, right, because I grew to like them. And then there's other bands who people pushed off my list because they drove me crazy about them. So anyways, it is what it is. It's a list of debut albums, a lot of which are very good. There's a couple of small discrepancies on my list, which I will discuss as I get to that, just to explain why there's a discrepancy, if any reason. Okay, so we're going to start with, just going to turn this just slightly here. Okay, so we're going to start with number 25. The bottom 3. The bottom 2, I flipped around and I put an album on the list and knocked one off because after I looked at the 3 albums that were at the bottom, or the 2 albums that were at the bottom, and then I decided that You know what? Even though I don't listen to this album much anymore, and it's not one of my favorite albums of all time, or even by the group, I still like it better than both of these albums. So it is a top favorite 25 debut album, so it's got to go on here if the rationale is correct. So I think the rationale is correct here. So we're going to start with number 25, an album I haven't had a long time. I've listened to it maybe a half dozen times, but because the other group that this artist came from doesn't have an album on the debut, and this one kind of fits in their sound, I decided that it's got to be on here. I just like it more than the other one that it should have been in the 25th spot, or could have been in the 25th spot, probably a better terminology. So we're talking about Steve Hackett's Voyage of the Acolyte. I've heard people say that this is the lost Genesis album, and then you'll hear members of the band saying, it's a load of nonsense, it's not a Genesis album at all. And there's a bit of truth in both of those things. It's not officially a Genesis album, nor was it anything that they all wrote on, so it couldn't have been considered a Genesis album. There was never a chance of that. However, there's enough of them on here that has a kind of a Genesis sound to it. I think Steve Hackett, of course, is on this. Phil Collins, I believe, is also on it, and Michael Rutherford are all on this album. So they do have some kind of a Genesis impact on the album and a feel to it. It does have that feel to it. I feel like it does, but I think it's very. It has a few too many instrumentals on here to be really a Genesis album, but it's still a very good album. I like it. It's on my list of albums that are waiting to get on to my playlist, because there's only room enough for so many, and so as they start to fade, I replace them with the ones in this list, and it's on that list to go on. So I mean, it's a solid album, I think. So I'm giving it at the number 25 today. Number 24, from my favorite rock band. This album wasn't going to be on this list. It was going to be in the honorable mentions, but I bumped it up to number 24 because I thought it was better than the Acolyte, Voyage of the Acolyte, and I thought it was better than the album that it bumped off, which I'll talk about in my honorable mentions later. And even though it's kind of faded with me more so over the last 15 or 20 years than it did in the first 15 or 20 years of its existence with me, there are a few songs, Finding My Way, and one other one who I'm drawing a blank on right now, but I still like to listen to those two particular tracks. The rest of the album, I'm not as keen on it. Once in a while I feel like it, but not too often. So the album has faded somewhat, but it still has enough life in it, and it's still enough strengths on it that it's got to be, to me, it's got to be in this spot, number 24. It could go up a little higher, or it could fall off completely, but today it's number 24. Rush's self-titled album. So number 23 is also a self-titled album, the only other one on my list from my group of 7. An album that I liked, but I found kind of creepy. And I never listened to it much. I think it's because there's a few too many creepy songs on it for me. But it does have some really, really solid tracks on it, and deserves to be mentioned here. Probably should be higher based on the quality of its tracks. We're talking about the self-titled album of Black Sabbath. Funny, I love all that Black Sabbath stuff from that era, but this album, and I know other people really like it. I've heard people talk about how great the album cover is and how menacing the whole album is. I just err on a little bit different on it. I just find it a little plotting, I guess is the word I'm looking for. Plotting a little bit. It's heavy but kind of creepy at the same time. The album cover is also kind of creepy. It's not a bad album, not by any stretch. I definitely would listen to it. Probably once a year I'll take it out and listen to it. And NIB is just such a fantastic song. The Wizard, great song, but just overall it just gives me a bit of a negative, creepy feeling, so I don't listen to it as much as the other stuff. And so I put it at number 23 for today. Okay, so we move up to number 22. An album who has one very, very strong track, and then a bunch of okay stuff, and then some stuff that I just never listened to. But the album, the one track is very, very powerful, and I had to move it up to number 22. We're talking about Face Value from Phil Collins' debut album. That In the Air Tonight has always had an impact on me. It had an impact on my daughter as well, so it's doubly impactful upon myself. So it's moved into the 22 spot. Number 21, Crosstown Rival here. Peter Gabriel's One. Basically somewhat of the same circumstances as Face Value. It has that one monster track, Salisbury Hill, but it has a little bit more depth to it than the Phil Collins one, I think, in my own opinion. It's not very much, it's like a hair, but I just think just a little bit more today. Maybe Face Value would win the next time I do this, I don't know, but for today I put the Gabriel, and this is probably my least favorite Gabriel album, but it's still pretty solid, and gets the number 21 spot today. Coming in at number 20, almost didn't even make this charts, but I decided, because I was listening to one of his other ones, which I'm doing a look back today on, and I thought, this has got some pretty solid stuff on it. Might as well go for a soda, lager, and ale. These are all tracks. I listened to this album quite a bit when it came out. I'm talking about Akimbo Lobo by Kim Mitchell. It actually initially started when I was putting this together being much higher, and then I said, no, it's not in the same league with these ones. But it still deserves to be on here, so I put it at number 20, just slightly ahead of Peter Gabriel's One, only because I just think that even though it doesn't have the monster hit like Salisbury Hill on it, it has 2 or 3 tracks that are better than anything on the Gabriel album, in my opinion. So then we move up to number 19. Again, any of these albums from about 19 down to about 25 could flip around on a given day. This album gets the nod because it has 2 or 3 solid tracks on it. Overall, the whole album is fairly solid. Again, it has that little bit of that Black Sabbath self-titled album feel to me. It's not creepy by any means, but it just has that kind of plodding, pedantic type of sound to it. Not all of the album. This one has less of that than the Black Sabbath, and we're talking about Led Zeppelin 1. Now, I know some people are going to, oh, you got to be crazy. That's one of the greatest albums, debut albums of all time. Well, for you, maybe it is. For me, I like a lot of the other Led Zeppelin stuff much better than this album. I just found like it wasn't, in the sound to it is not that great either, in my opinion. And it has, like, I like the song Communication Breakdown. I like Dazed and Confused, the normal tracks that people would like, but I'm just not sold on the rest of the album. So, but it's still good and solid. Even at its level, it's still good and solid, and finished ahead of the other 6 albums that it that preceded it on this list, because of its overall strength. I think overall, I think it's just a little bit better than the others. So then we move to number 18, which is a bit of a jump now. Like, none of these bottom albums could have finished higher than the Zeppelin 19. So this album is the first. It's kind of in a void here. It's better than those albums, but not quite up to the next level. But it's good enough to be positioned in number 18. It's an album that I listened to quite a bit when I got it. Haven't listened to it much, but still like a lot of the tracks on it. We're talking about Script for a Jester's Tear from Marillion, an album I bought when it came out. Played it a lot. Strong album. And at that point in time, it had a bit of an advantage because a lot of the progressive rock bands of the 70s had begun to change. Not all of them. Like Yes was still had Drama coming out, and Rush still had its Moving Pictures and all that. But there was a move to change, and Marillion began to take advantage of that and pull in ahead of some of these bands. Anyway, so Script for a Jester's Tear, solid album. I'm coming in at number 18. Number 17 is the self-titled album from the Cars. This album and the 1, 2, 3 above it are all fairly close. Not so close as the bottom 19 to 25 were, but close enough that they're not far apart from each other. So I like Rick Ocasek's voice on this quite a bit, and much better than Orr's voice on this particular album. Or it might be just that the songs that Ocasek sang were just ones that were more memorable for me. Pretty solid Cars album. The next album was really the big one for me, but pretty solid here. And it battled out with me when I was deciding on this list. It was between this and the album that moved ahead. Actually, yeah, the album that moved ahead I ultimately gave just for I just think that the Cars overall track was just slightly not as good as the overall, and we're talking about number 16 of BTO 1, which has overall a better sound, I think, better songs. Also, BTO has about 2 or 3 songs on this album that are really strong BTO songs. The Cars have 2 or 3 on their album that are also very strong, but I think the BTO stuff is just a little bit better. So I put BTO at 16. I don't think this BTO album is as good as the next 2 or 3 that come along, but it's a pretty solid BTO album. All the BTO albums, the early ones at least, were all really pretty solid albums. It does have a couple of tankers in it, but nothing serious. Okay, coming in at number 15, an album I have not listened to for a million years. And when I was looking up these debuts, I was like, oh wow, I completely forgot about this album because I paid more attention to some of their later stuff. But this album has 1 or 2 of the very best tracks by this group. Hence the reason why I think it coming in at 15, it pulled ahead of BTO and the Cars and Marillion and them, basically because of the strength of its top tracks on the album. And we're talking about Orlando's D'Amour by the Police, a couple of like Roxanne, Can't Stand Losing. Like, these are 2 of the Police's very best songs, and the overall sound of the album is pretty solid. I do like these 2 tracks a lot, and I forgot how much I liked them until I actually started looking at these debut albums and realized, oh wow, I have to have this album on my list. It's got to be up here somewhere. And it finished at number 15. Beaten out ever so slightly by number 14, which is Holy Diver by R.J. Dio, an album that in its day would have blown this album away, but it hasn't aged well with me. It's not as good as I once thought. I don't think the guitar playing is legendary as people say it is, or as I've heard it before. It's good. I just don't think it rates in the top guitar. You know, some people would say this is Ronnie James Dio's, like Vivian Campbell is Ronnie James Dio's answer to Ozzy Osbourne's Randy Rhoads. Well, I don't really think that way. And that's an album I didn't include on my list, The Blizzard of Oz. It should have probably been on here, but it was an oversight on my part, so it could have probably made this list as well, but it has no staying power. It's completely dead with me. I never listened to it at all, so once I realized I'd forgotten to include it on this list at all, I just decided that, I'm not going to lose any sleep over it. It's not an album I think about much anymore. At the time, it was a mega hit for me, and pretty much the same as this album, Holy Diver. But this album has had more staying power. The title track and a couple of other tracks on here are very solid rock tracks, which I like and love quite a bit, actually. So that puts this album at number 14, Ronnie James Dio's Holy Diver. As for you Ozzy fans, I'm sorry, I missed it. It should have been on here somewhere. Probably would have been, at very least, have been in the honorable mention, so maybe I'll throw that in there at the end. Next up, now we move to number 13, which is a fair step up from Holy Diver. At one time, Holy Diver would have been in this top 10 or so, but it's faded over years. Haven't listened to it much. I've gotten it recently, so I've been listening to it a little bit more. But the self-titled album by Kiss, 7 tracks on there that are classics, and many of them, Strutter, Deuce, Black Diamond, are all among my favorite Kiss songs of all time. So this album has to get mentioned. The only thing about this is that most of the tracks I just said, and a lot of the Kiss, like this album had 7 tracks on their Kiss Alive album, and most of the time I listen to these tracks, it'll be off of that album, not off of this one, which I think is a little more tame and doesn't really have the sound that the Alive album does. But it's still not bad. It's still pretty good. Good enough to finish 13th here. Okay. Number 12. I would have laughed if I'd said this a decade ago, or even 2 decades. Well, I couldn't have said it 2 decades ago. Maybe a decade ago, I would have laughed if anybody even had suggested this to me, that this album could beat out a Kiss album, especially the debut album. But I just love it. I love the album. It's an album that my daughter got, that she listened to all the time, and I just grew to love it. It's a power pop album, but it has 6 or 7 really good, solid tracks on it, and a few of them that are outstanding to me. It does have some ballady type stuff on it, but you're going to get that with this type of artist. And this is, I don't even know if you would call this a rock album. It's a power pop. A little bit heavier than most power pops, but definitely a great debut album by this artist. We're talking about the Breakout album from Miley Cyrus. I've listened to a lot of Miley stuff over the years because that's what my daughter used to like to listen to. Most of it's okay. I don't dislike it or whatever, but this particular album I like a lot, and it's her debut, so we're going to give it number 12. Breakout, Miley Cyrus, beating out Kiss. Who would have bought it? Or Ronnie James Dio. Wow. I must be losing it. Oh, the other thing about the Kiss album I wanted to mention here. It's a bit of a... I guess it's an asterisk, but really it isn't. I don't know how to explain it. Kiss put out 4 solo albums under their own label, under their own moniker, under the Kiss label. Each of the band members did one. In essence, it's their first solo albums, right? But it's under the Kiss moniker, so it's not really a solo album. Because if you were to classify them as solo albums, there is no doubt in my mind that Ace Frehley's solo album debut would be number 1 on my list. It wouldn't even really be that close. It's a top 10 favorite album of all time, and would deserve that kind of mention here. But because it's under the Kiss label, I'm not labeling it as a solo. I'm not labeling it as a debut album, and so it's not going to get the kind of mention here that it probably deserves to have. Anyways, that was just one of the funny stories that I discovered while doing this. And I debated on it. I said, no, you can't because it's a Kiss album. It says Kiss right on it, and it's not a debut album. This is their debut. So anyways, back up past Miley now to an album that I didn't really want to include because of its horrific graphic nature. I just think that it has a lot of kind of negativity to it and a lot of hostility to it that, you know, the average person probably doesn't like. However, all that aside, it's a masterpiece as far as every single song on this album is memorable. Every single song on this album is crunching. They all have had impacts. I listened to the album a lot when I got it. I don't listen to it much now, but I did a lot, especially when I was younger. I was really into the And we're talking about Nevermind the Bullocks by the Sex Pistols coming in at number 11. Probably in the day it would have came right near the top, you know, but it's faded because of all of that other stuff I mentioned earlier. But it still deserves to have credit given to it for being what it is, which is a really raw, pounding album with a lot of really solid tracks. Okay, so now we move to the top 10. Number 10, number 9. Yeah, number 10 and number 11, they could switch around. But number 9 number 9 and number 8. Yeah, number 9, number 8 could switch, but there's a bit of a gap between the four songs, well, the two pairs anyways, 11 and 10, and then 9 and 8. There's a little bit of gap between the two groups, but once you get in the top 7, they pretty much are dominant albums. Like, those albums are my best. So anyways, we'll move with number 10 right away, which is Stevie Ray Vaughan's Texas Flood. A big impactful album when I started listening to Stevie Ray Vaughan. And I got into him around the same time period as the David Bowie Let's Dance album because I listened to that album. I went to that concert, one of my last concerts. And I discovered that Stevie Ray Vaughan had been the guitarist with that band, so I started listening to him, and then I discovered first the sophomore album, and then this one, went back and got Texas Flood. This is a fantastic album. If you are not really a rhythm and blues person, you could probably still like this album quite a bit. It's just like chock full of some serious guitar playing, some serious music, real strong rhythm and blues. The album is really good. So number 10, Texas Flood from Stevie Ray Vaughan. Number 9, it may not even be a rock album. It has some bluesy tones to it. Definitely has some reggae tones to it. And has that island sound to it quite a bit, but it's much better production than most of these albums. The vocals, of course, are off the charts for me. It's just among my favorite vocalists of all time. And the songs are really memorable. It's not overly heavy, but it has some heavy parts in it. And so I included it on this list because of the artist's voice and because of the overall feel of the album. And I'm talking about Music of the Sun by Rihanna. Probably doesn't deserve to be on my top rock 25 of all time, but I never disclude her when it comes to these kind of things just because she is among my favorite vocalists. As a person, I don't really want to get into that, but as a vocalist, she's up there. Okay, so then we're going to move on to number 8, which beat out this album, and it's a power pop, hard rock album, to my way of thinking. Got some real great guitar work on it, some fantastic tunes, and another female vocalist with great, not necessarily a great voice, but a distinct voice for sure. And the album itself has some real pretty heavy stuff on it. But it's almost When I think of this album, it's almost in the same kind of vein as I think of the Sex Pistols. It's kind of got that kind of raw, powery, kind of punky sound to it. But it isn't, I don't think of it as a punk band, but they just have that little edge to them. Talk about the Pretenders debut album, Pretenders 1. It's a really solid album, man, like from top to bottom. I remember getting this and just really blasting it pretty heavily. So then we're going to move up to the next group. The top four are pretty much cemented. The next three could go either way, any way on any given day. And they're all very different. These next three bands are all completely different for different reasons. But all three of these albums are just chock full of like super strong stuff, right? So we're going to start with the most recent of them, and the reason it finished 7th is because it just doesn't have enough longevity to challenge these other two. But it has a lot. Like from top to bottom, I like all the tracks. There's no bad tracks on this album, in my opinion. It's very poppy. Has that kind of Aussie feel to it. But it's really good. Like a lot of little good things on it that you don't get on some of these other albums. Some little flute and some little sax on here too. Stuff that I don't normally think of as being a strong album, but this just has every single track on here so catchy and so grabbing. We're talking about Business as Usual from Men at Work. Just love this album, and it's on my playlist. It's the longest album on my playlist, currently on my playlist, and it could go into 30 weeks. Very few of my albums get that far. Maybe one. You might get. I've had a few make it as far as maybe 30, 35 weeks. This one's already approaching like 30 weeks, I'm sure of it, and it's not. It's starting to fade with me a bit now, but initially I played it constantly. It's such a good album. Just every track on it I like. The one that got me going, of course, was Be Good, Be Good, which I really like a lot. But a lot of the stuff that was on the radio I liked a little bit less because it's a little bit of a burnout on it. But a lot of the deeper cuts are really solid stuff. So if you like that kind of pop sound, but in a rock sense, this is a band that you should maybe check out. This is a great debut album by a fantastic band. So coming in at number 7, Business as Usual by Men at Work. Now number 6, when it first came out, had a much bigger impact than even the Business as Usual, that's basically how I decided on which one was going to go first. Is Business as Usual is fairly new to my music world, had a big impact, but this one had just slightly more of an impact, and plus it has the longevity. So if Business as Usual can do as good as this album, it's going to be up there. So we're coming out with the debut album of Van Halen 1. From top to bottom, there isn't a poor track on this album. It may be the only Van Halen album like that. Even My Fair Warning, which I love, which is my favorite Van Halen album by a country mile, doesn't have the solidness from top to bottom that this has. That from the opening ripping guitar right through, you just like, what was that? That was when I first heard it, what is that? And I just loved, right from the get-go, I loved David Lee Roth as a stage presence, as a front man, as a vocalist, all of those things. He was my idol, man, right away. So coming in at number 6, Van Halen 1, or Van Halen's debut album, if you prefer. Then we go to the number 5 position, an album that many consider to be the greatest debut album ever produced. Certainly sales support that aspect very well. Over $17-18 million in sales. Such a legendary album with so many solid tracks, right from the number 1 hit right off the bat through the entire album is just laced with hits, And you think that this guy did this all in his basement. Unbelievable. And of course, we're talking about Boston's self-titled debut album, which also has a fantastic cover on it. And yet, the funny thing about this album is that it had almost the reverse of a lot of these albums with me. It had a almost immediate negative impact. I got it for Christmas. And I remember being hugely disappointed. I didn't even unwrap. I took it out of the thing and I just didn't say anything. I was so disappointed. It was hard for me to keep my mouth shut. And it wasn't because of the album, because I never heard it. I didn't know anything about it. I'd never seen it before that second. It was because I was expecting, I'd seen that package under the tree and I was like salivating at the thought that that was going to be Kiss's Destroyer. I was like ready to give birth. That's how excited I was. But when I opened it and it was this album, such a huge, massive letdown. I didn't even open that album for almost 2 or 3 years. It just stayed in my closet. I couldn't get rid of it because my parents had bought it for me, but I refused to listen to it. And then something must have happened. I don't know when, but I must have heard 1 or 2 of the tracks on the radio when I started getting out of my Kiss phase in the late 70s. I started moving away from Kiss to listen to other stuff because Kiss was changing and they left the door open for me to find other things, and I started finding other things. And so while I was listening to these other things, I heard this Boston album, at least the self-title. I said, wow, that's really good. And I went back and listened, looked in the closet, and it still was unwrapped, still in its shrink wrap. And I thought, well, it's time. So I opened it up, and then, at first was a little harder for me to listen to, but then I gradually grew into the point where this is a number 5 album for me. Probably was higher at some points before some of these albums had come along, but definitely a top 5 album. In the 9 percentile, they would say. So here it is, self-titled Boston. So number 4. Number 4, number 3, number 2, number 1. Could all have flipped. I had each of them at some point during this interesting and enjoyable tour de force, if you want to call it, of putting together this thing. Each one of them had at one point been in the number 1 spot briefly, some longer, but ultimately this song ended up 4th for basically one reason and one reason only. It's just longevity. It has more longevity than the top album. Has many great tracks, maybe more great tracks than the 2 albums. Sorry, I didn't get a drink here. That finished 2nd and 3rd. But I think it's just, I played it more than the other albums over time, and it's just kind of worn just a little bit more than the others. We're talking about, for number 4, we're talking about Are You Experienced by Jimi Hendrix. I think maybe it lost a little ground too because it's not my favorite Jimi Hendrix album. My favorite is Axis Bold as Love. That's the one I had first. That's the one I played the most. So maybe it lost a little bit because of that. And it's a little bit dated from the other albums. A little bit, maybe less put together well. But the tracks are fantastic. Like, there's some serious music on this album. Among Jimmy's best stuff, I think. And among the best stuff in rock history, period. So it comes in at number 4 by a hair. The next 2 albums flipped a couple times. The reason that they flipped is because the one album had such a monster success with me when it first came out. I just literally just destroyed the album. I played it so much. And every once in a while I just play it all the time, or it's in my head all the time. And I almost put it second, but the other album I got recently, and I've been listening to it a lot more, and I think overall I think it just comes down to musicianship. I just think that the musicianship on the one album is just a tiny bit better than on the other album, maybe a little bit more than a tiny bit better, and the vocals are better on the other album. But this is a power pop album, number 3. Power pop, just legendary music. Was mind-blowingly successful with me when it first came out. Mind you, I was 15 at the time, so I was influenced greatly by a lot more poppy stuff than I would have been now. And we're talking about Get the Knack by The Knack coming in at number 3. Such memorable riffs and guitar solos, and especially in those big hits like My Sharona and She's So Selfish. But even the lesser tracks are just really solid on this album. It hasn't aged as well because it couldn't stay at that level. It eventually burned out, and it's never really quite captured that again, but it's still a really solid album. So the album that beat it out, that came number 2, beat it out because I like the vocalist better, and I just think the overall musicianship and arrangement of the album is more in line with the way I am now and the way I've grown over the years. And we're talking about Dreamboat Annie from Heart. It has some Tully sound to it as well, which really helps it a lot. But it's very diverse, has some big hits, but also has some very acoustic stuff. A little bit of folky stuff in here too. But the tracks from one right through to the last track are all good. There's no bad tracks on here. There's some that are better than others. Its deep cuts are as good as some of its big hits as well. So, like, the bigger hits like Crazy on You and Magic Man, they are stacked up well against by Sing Child Sing and Dreamboat Annie, the title track. Like, these are just like some of my favorite songs, period. So it gets the number 2 spot today. Probably would have gotten number 1 if I'd done this a month or 2 ago, because it would have had more longevity. But the album that I chose has been around now for a year. I'm still listening to it a lot. It's not on my playlist anymore, but I still listen to it. I just think that I missed the boat on this album when it first came out. Otherwise, it would be easily number 1 here because of the longevity. It doesn't have the longevity that it probably should have had because I didn't listen to this group for, some of the reasons that I never listened to Jethro Tull or Pink Floyd. Some of these discussions you've heard me have before, because one song got in my head and I labeled the whole group that way and stayed away from them. Kind of a similar thing here. The song that got in my head from them was, and of course we're talking about The Court of the Crimson King by King Crimson. It's going to come in at number 1 today. And it's there because every single track on this album is just amazing, with the exception of 21st Century Schizoid Man, which I first heard done by April Wine. I didn't really like it, and then I heard them do it. I liked it a little more, but I still didn't really like it, and it kept me from listening to this band for a long time. But the rest of this album is really solid. Some people would say you got it wrong. The 21st Century Schizoid Man is the best song on the album. It's the heaviest, but heaviness isn't always a criteria for best with me. Sometimes it is, but in the case of this album, it isn't. The other 4 tracks I like better, and I love all the other tracks. Epitaph, just really well put together. Excellent musicianship, fantastic vocals by Greg Lake. The songs are all really memorable. I listened to this album quite a bit. I love the album and the album cover. I'm now into the second album, In the Wake of Poseidon, and I think it's going to be even better, which is hard to believe because this is a fantastic debut album. Yeah, to me it is, because it's number 1. And it's a band that it's long overdue on my listening. Like, they should be up there battling Yes and Genesis and Rush for my top spot, not just getting onto the charts after 40 years of them. They don't even exist anymore, and now I'm getting into it. Excuse me. So anyways, I've dragged this video out for 44 minutes because I've loved doing this so much. I learned a lot about some of the music that I've listened to. It's reminded me of some albums that I haven't listened to for a long time. It's brought up some new stuff that I'm going to listen to, and some stuff that's growing on me. So it's got a little bit of everything, really. So I'm going to do it quickly from top to bottom, and then give you the few honorable mentions that I kept from my list. The Court of the Crimson King by King Crimson comes in at number 1. Number 2, Dreamboat Annie, Heart. Number 3, Get the Knack by The Knack. Number 4, Are You Experienced by Jimi Hendrix and The Experience. Number 5, the self-titled album by Boston. Number 6, Van Halen 1 by Van Halen. Number 7, Business as Usual by Men at Work. Number 8, Pretenders 1 by Pretenders. Music of the Sun by Rihanna comes in at 9. Number 10 is Texas Flood by Stevie Ray Vaughan. Number 11 is Nevermind the Bullocks by the Sex Pistols. Number 12 is Breakout by Miley Cyrus. Number 13 is the self-titled Kiss album. Number 14 is Holy Diver by Ronnie James Dio. Number 15, Outlandos d'Amour by Police. Number 16 is the BTO1 by Bachman Turner Overdrive, of course. Number 17 is the self-titled Cars album. Number 18 is the Script for the Jester's Tear by Marillion. Number 19 is that debut album from 1969, Led Zeppelin 1 by Led Zeppelin. Maybe the greatest rock band of all time, possibly. I'm not going to argue. Number 20, Kimbo Lobo by Kim Mitchell. One of the few rock stars in history that I've actually met. Number 21, Peter Gabriel 1 from Peter Gabriel. Number 22, Face Value from Phil Collins. Number 23, self-titled Black Sabbath album. Number 24, self-titled Rush album. And number 25, The Voyage of the Acolyte by Steve Hackett. Apparently my throat can't stand up to this length of a conference. Okay, I'll do my honorable mentions quickly. The album that was on but got knocked off at the last minute was The Doors' self-titled album. I wanted to put it on there. I've been enjoying that album quite a bit, and I've got a fairly substantial Doors collection going, but I just couldn't. It just didn't quite make it, but maybe it will next time. Steely Dan, Can't Buy a Thrill, good album. Robert Plant, I saw this tour, Pictures at 11, great, another great album. And then for a last throw in, I put the Eagles self-titled album, which is good. I'm not really a country, and this is a little more country than I normally listen to, but still a solid album. And there's quite a few other albums that were kind of just off the marker here. The Beatles' Please Please Me, pretty good. The Who's Generation, all these kind of things like that, but they weren't quite good enough to get the honorable mentions. So if you have your own honorable mentions, and then of course I forgot Ozzy Osbourne's Blizzard of Oz, which might have been able to make the top 25. Definitely would have been in the top 5 when it first came out, but faded quite a bit, as did Ozzy and all of that stuff. I actually think I like Diary of a Madman more now. It's one of the few albums that I will listen to on occasion. But the Blizzard of Oz, fantastic guitar playing of Randy Rhoads there, so I just want to throw that in as an honorable mention as well. I think he is probably the greatest guitar player that only had 2 albums in history. Or 3. Was it 3? Yeah, I think they did an EP as well with You Said It All and Suicidal Solution and maybe Mr. Crowley, maybe. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this. It was fun to put on, and I'm now thinking that maybe I'll do a sophomore. Maybe I'll do a sequel to this, sophomore albums, because it's funny how some of those bands that didn't have much going on in the first album really came to life in the second album, and vice versa. Anyways, I hope you liked it, so please subscribe and like, and have yourself a great day. Frog Monster out.